Look around your home right now. The walls, the roof, the floor beneath you. The simple fact that you have a fixed address, a place you return to every night. This seems so natural, so obvious, that it is hard to imagine any other way, but for most of human history, there was no such thing as home. There were only temporary camps, places to sleep for a night or a season. The first permanent human settlements appeared roughly 12,000 years ago. Before that, for over 200,000 years of modern human existence, we were nomads, wanderers. People who followed the food and left no lasting trace on the land. The decision to stay in one place changed everything about what it means to be human. If you are settling in for the night, this is perfect company. The story of how humans first settled down, how we stopped wandering and started building, how the world before cities shaped the world of cities that came after. Subscribe and stick around. Let's start with what nomadic life actually looked like. For most of human history, people lived in small bands of perhaps 20 to 50 individuals. They moved with the seasons, following animal migrations, visiting areas where plants ripened at different times. Their homes were temporary structures, easily built and easily abandoned. These nomads weren't poor or primitive in any meaningful sense. They had rich cultures, complex social relationships, deep knowledge of their environments. They worked fewer hours than most modern people. They ate varied diets. Their lives were not worse than ours, just profoundly different. The nomadic lifestyle had advantages we've lost. No property disputes because there was little property. No accumulated wealth to fight over. No permanent hierarchy because leadership changed with circumstances. A certain equality enforced by the need to carry everything you owned. But nomadism also had constraints. You couldn't accumulate more than you could carry. You couldn't build anything lasting. You couldn't store food for long periods. You were always subject to the movements of your prey and the ripening of wild plants. Something changed around 12,000 years ago. In several places around the world, more or less simultaneously, people began to stay put. They built structures meant to last. They invested in places they would return to. The first settlements emerged. Why did this happen? The traditional answer is agriculture. People discovered they could plant seeds and harvest crops. This required staying in one place to tend the fields. Settlement followed farming. That is the story most of us learned, but recent evidence complicates this story. Some of the earliest known settlements, like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, predate agriculture. People gathered there for ritual purposes, built massive stone structures, and stayed long enough to create something permanent. Settlement might have preceded farming, not followed it. Göbekli Tepe is astonishing. Massive carved pillars arranged in circles, built around 11,500 years ago, before pottery. Before metal tools, before domesticated crops hunter, gatherers built this, investing enormous labor in a place they intended to keep returning to. What drew them there? The site appears to have been a ritual center, a place for gatherings that brought together people from a wide region. The desire to create sacred space, to mark certain locations as special, might have been the first impulse towards settlement. Religion before agriculture, temples before granaries. the need for meaning before the need for food storage. This possibility reshapes how we think about the origins of settlement. We didn't settle because we had to. We settled because we wanted to create something lasting. But eventually, agriculture did become central to settlement. The domestication of plants and animals transformed what staying in one place could mean. You could produce more food than you could gather. You could store surplus for lean times. You could feed people who didn't produce food themselves. The earliest domesticated plants included wheat, barley, and legumes in the Middle East, rice in China, corn, beans, and squash in the Americas. Different regions developed different agricultural packages, but the pattern was similar everywhere. Plants that could be cultivated replaced plants that had to be found. Animal domestication followed or accompanied plant domestication. Sheep, goats, pigs, cattle, animals that provided meat, milk, wool, labor, living resources that could be controlled and bred rather than hunted and hoped for. The combination of plant and animal domestication created something new, the agricultural village, a permanent settlement where people grew crops, raised animals, and stayed generation after generation. The basic unit of human habitation for the next 10,000 years. What did life in these first villages look like? We can reconstruct some of it from archaeology. The houses were small, often just 1 or 2 rooms. Families lived in close quarters, with little privacy. Storage facilities for grain were as important as living spaces. Fatal Feyfake in Turkey gives us the best picture of early village life. Occupied from about 9,500 to 7,700 years ago, it held perhaps 8,000 people at its peak, one of the first true towns in human history. The houses at Fatal Feyfake were packed together with no streets between them. People entered through holes in the roofs, climbing down ladders into their living spaces. The rooftops served as the public space, the walkways, the places where social life happened. Inside the houses, people buried their dead beneath the floors, ancestors literally underfoot, present in daily life. The living and dead sharing space in ways that would seem strange to most modern people, but made sense when home meant the place your family had always been. The walls were decorated with paintings and reliefs, bulls' heads, geometric patterns, scenes that might represent hunts or rituals. The impulse to decorate, to make spaces meaningful, was there from the beginning of settlement. Daily life in these early villages was dominated by food production, planting, tending, harvesting, processing, storing. The agricultural cycle structured the year in ways that nomadic life never had. Seasons meant specific tasks, repeated generation after generation. The work was hard, harder than nomadic foraging. By most measures, early farmers were shorter and less healthy than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Their bones show more signs of repetitive stress. Their teeth show more decay from grain. Heavy diets. Why did people accept this harder life? The question has puzzled researchers for decades. The best answer might be that they didn't know it would be harder, or that population growth made nomadism impossible, or that the benefits of surplus, of security, of permanence outweighed the costs. Surplus was the key benefit. For the first time, people could produce more food than they immediately needed. This surplus could be stored against bad times. It could support people who didn't produce food, specialists who made tools or built structures or performed rituals. Specialization followed surplus. In a nomadic band, everyone had to contribute to food acquisition. In a settled village, some people could specialize: potters, weavers, builders, priests. The division of labor that would eventually create cities began in the first villages. Property changed too. Nomads had personal possessions, but little sense of land ownership. Settled people invested years of labor in fields and structures. They expected to benefit from that investment. Private property and the conflicts it creates emerged with settlement. Hierarchy appeared. Nomadic bands were relatively egalitarian. Because mobility limited accumulation, settled villages allowed some families to accumulate more than others. Wealth could be passed down. Inequality could compound across generations. The first villages were probably still relatively equal. True stratification would come later, with cities and states. But the seeds were planted. The mechanisms that would create kings and peasants, rich and poor, were established in the first permanent settlements. If you are still with me, consider what settlement meant for human psychology. For 200,000 years, humans were adapted to nomadic life. Then, in just a few thousand years, everything changed. Our minds, evolved for wandering, had to adapt to staying put. Some adaptations were easy. Humans are flexible. We can learn to live in many different ways. The basic cognitive equipment for settlement was already present in nomadic humans. Planning, cooperation, tool use, language, all transferred to the new context. Other adaptations were harder. The constant proximity to the same people, the reduced mobility when conflicts arose, the new stresses of property and hierarchy, the diseases that spread in dense populations. Settlement created problems nomadism hadn't prepared us for. Disease, in particular, became a major factor. Dense populations sharing space with domesticated animals created perfect conditions for infectious diseases. Epidemics became possible in ways they hadn't been among scattered nomadic bands. The childhood diseases that plagued humanity, until recent vaccination programs emerged from early settlements: measles, smallpox, influenza, diseases that jumped from animals to humans and spread through crowded villages. The price of proximity. Social problems emerged too. Crime became possible when there was property to steal. Organized violence became possible when there were surpluses to fight over. The first wars probably occurred between early villages competing for resources, but settlement also enabled cooperation at new scales. More people working together on larger projects, irrigation systems, defensive walls, temples, and monuments. Things that required coordinated labor beyond what any nomadic band could muster. The first villages were experiments in a new way of living. Some succeeded and grew into towns and eventually cities. Others failed and were abandoned. The archaeological record is full of settlements that lasted only a few generations before people moved on. What made some settlements succeed while others failed? Location mattered. Access to water, fertile soil, defensible positions. Social organization mattered. Ways of resolving conflicts, distributing resources, making collective decisions. Luck mattered. Disease, drought, invasion could destroy even well-located, well-organized villages. The successful settlements grew. More people meant more labor, which meant more surplus, which could support even more people. A positive feedback loop that would eventually produce cities of hundreds of thousands. But it started with villages of a few hundred. The growth wasn't smooth. Climate fluctuations caused famines. Plagues swept through. Conflicts destroyed villages. The path from first settlement to modern city was not a straight line but a jagged one, with many setbacks and restarts. Around 6,000 years ago, the first true cities appeared. Uruk in Mesopotamia might have held 40,000 people at its peak, a scale of human aggregation unprecedented in history. But Uruk rested on foundations laid by thousands of years of village life. The cities brought new possibilities and new problems. Writing to track the complex transactions of urban economies, bureaucracy, to manage populations too large to face governance, standing armies, to defend accumulated wealth, all consequences of the settlement that began in villages. But tonight we're focused on the time before cities, the villages and small towns that represented the first experiments in settled life, the period between nomadism and urbanism that lasted thousands of years and shaped who we became. What was daily life like in these first settlements? We can imagine a typical day in a village around 8,000 years ago. Dawn brings the start of work. Animals to feed, fields to tend, grain to process. The work is communal but household. Based extended families cooperate on tasks too large for individuals. Planting and harvest bring the whole village together. But daily labor centers on the household, the basic economic unit. Children work alongside adults from an early age. There is no concept of childhood as a protected period of play and learning. Children learn by doing, contributing to household labor as soon as they're able. Education is apprenticeship. Women's work centers on food processing, textile production, childcare. Men's work on agriculture, herding, construction. The division isn't absolute, but it is consistent across most early agricultural societies. Gender roles harden with settlement. Meals punctuate the day. Breakfast before work. A midday meal in the fields or at home. Dinner as the day's labor ends. Food is monotonous by modern standards. Grain-based porridges and breads. Vegetables in season, meat rarely. Evening brings social time. Families gather, neighbors visit. Stories are told, disputes are discussed, and sometimes resolved. The social fabric of the village is maintained through these daily interactions, the accumulated conversations of years. Night falls, and people retreat to their homes. Small spaces shared by multiple generations. Little privacy, little separation. Sleep comes early because there is little to do after dark without artificial light. Dawn will bring the cycle again. The yearly cycle matters more than the daily one. Planting in spring, tending through summer, harvest in fall. The lean months of winter, surviving on stored grain, the agricultural year structures, life in ways the nomadic year never did. Religious festivals mark the seasons, planting rituals to ensure good crops, harvest celebrations to give thanks, solstice and equinox observations that connect agricultural time to cosmic time. Religion and agriculture intertwine. Death and birth are community events. Everyone knows when someone dies. Everyone knows when someone is born. The population is small enough that every individual matters. Every loss is felt. Every addition is celebrated. Conflict is inevitable in such close quarters. Disputes over land, water, animals, personal grudges that fester. Because there is no escape from the people who wronged you. Village politics can be intense because the stakes of social relationships are so high. Some villages develop formal mechanisms for conflict resolution. Councils of elders, ritual reconciliation, punishment for transgressions. The beginnings of law, still informal but necessary for communities too large for purely personal relationships. Trade connects villages to the wider world. Goods that can't be produced locally are obtained through exchange. Obsidian for tools, shells for ornaments, ideas and techniques spreading along trade routes. No village is truly isolated. Visitors bring news from other places. What is happening in distant villages? Rumors of events beyond the horizon. The world is small by modern standards, but larger than the immediate community. Information travels slowly but travels. Marriage often connects families across villages. Exogamy, marrying outside your own group, prevents inbreeding and creates alliances. A network of family relationships extends beyond any single settlement. The region is a web of connected communities. The identity of villages is layered. You belong to your household, your lineage, your village, your region, your people. Each layer matters in different contexts. The nested identities of settled life are more complex than nomadic band membership. If you are drifting off now, consider how much of this still echoes in modern life. The daily and yearly rhythms, the household as basic unit, the gendered division of labor, though now contested, the nested identities. The village persists inside us. Most humans who have ever lived were village dwellers. Not nomads and not city people. But villagers, the agricultural village, is the most common form of human settlement in history. We are, most of us, descended from village people. Transition from village to city came slowly for most. Cities appeared, but the vast majority of people remained in villages, producing the food that fed urban populations. Even today, a significant portion of humanity lives in villages. The psychological adaptations to village life might be our deepest, deeper than nomadic instincts, because more recent, deeper than urban adaptations, because more universal we're wired for village. Scale society, and we feel the mismatch in cities. The loneliness of modern urban life might reflect this mismatch. In a village, everyone knows you. In a city, almost no one does. The anonymity that cities provide can feel like freedom, but it can also feel like abandonment. We're not built for anonymity. The social media platforms that connect modern people might be attempts to recreate village, scale sociality. A network where you know everyone's business, where reputation matters, where the community witnesses your life. Digital villages for village, adapted minds. But digital villages, lack something the real ones had: physical presence, shared space, the accountability that comes from seeing someone face to face after you've wronged them. Online communities can feel village-like, but they're missing dimensions. The first settlements also established patterns of land use that persist today. The concept of owned land, the idea that certain places belong to certain people, the expectation that investment in land should pay returns. Property law traces back to the first villages. Environmental impacts began with settlement too. Deforestation to clear fields, irrigation that changed hydrology, grazing that transformed grasslands. The human footprint on landscapes began light, but grew heavier with each generation of settled agriculture. Some early settlements degraded their environments and had to be abandoned. The archaeological record shows villages surrounded by increasingly poor soil. The lesson that sustainability matters was learned early, often too late. The successful settlements were the ones that found sustainable relationships with their environments. Farming systems that maintained soil fertility, grazing patterns that didn't overexploit grasslands. Sustainable settlement is an old problem, not a new one. Rest now thinking about these first settlements. The experiments in staying put that eventually produced everything from villages to cities to the nations that contain both. The moment when humans stopped wandering and started building. Your home tonight is the distant descendant of those first permanent structures. The walls around you evolved from mud brick and stone. The concept that you belong somewhere, that somewhere belongs to you, began in villages 12,000 years ago. The people who built the first settlements couldn't have imagined what would follow. The cities and empires and technologies that permanent dwelling would make possible. They were just trying to solve immediate problems. The consequences unfolded across millennia. And we can't imagine what follows from the choices we make today. The settlements we're building now, physical and digital, will have consequences we can't foresee. We're continuing the experiment our ancestors began with no more certainty about outcomes. That is both humbling and freeing. Humbling because we're not in control of long-term outcomes. Freeing because we're not responsible for consequences we can't predict. All we can do is make the best choices we can with the knowledge we have. The first settlers did that. They made choices that seemed reasonable, that solved problems they faced. They couldn't know they were founding a new way of being human. They were just living their lives, day by day, making do. Thanks for this journey to the first settlements, to the villages that preceded cities, to the experiments in permanent dwelling that made everything after possible. To the ancestors who stopped wandering and started staying. Subscribe and stick around for more explorations of how we became what we are. More stories from the transitions that shaped human existence. More evidence that understanding the past helps understand the present. Sleep well tonight in your settled dwelling, in the walls that evolved from mud and stone, in the home that connects you to 12,000 years of staying put. You are living the experiment your ancestors began. Good night from the first villages, from the people who decided to stay, from the beginning of everything that followed from that decision. Before cities, there were villages. Before villages, there was wandering. You live in the world that villages made. Rest well in it. Good night. But before you drift away, there is more to consider about life before cities. The psychological transformations that settlement required. The ways that staying in one place changed how humans thought about themselves and the world. Nomadic people lived in a world of movement and flow. Places were visited, used, left behind. No single location held special importance beyond its immediate utility. The landscape was a network of resources, not a collection of owned territories. Settled people lived in a different mental world. One place became central, became home, became the axis around which life revolved. Other places were measured by their distance from this center. The world organized itself around the settlement. This shift in spatial thinking was profound. Nomads thought in terms of paths and journeys. Settlers thought in terms of centers and peripheries. The very structure of mental maps changed with settlement. Time changed too. Nomadic time was cyclical but unmoored from place. The same seasons brought the same activities, but in different locations. Settled time was cyclical and rooted. The same seasons brought the same activities in the same places. Memory and location fused. The accumulation of memory in place created something new. A sense of history. The knowledge that people had lived here before. That events had happened here. That the land itself carried stories. Place-based memory is a settler phenomenon. Ancestors buried under house floors were part of this. The dead weren't left behind when the band moved on. They were present, literally underfoot. The relationship between living and dead changed because both remained in the same place. Inheritance became possible in new ways. You could inherit not just objects but land, structures, positions in the community. The investments of one generation could be passed to the next. Wealth could accumulate across lifetimes. This created new motivations, working not just for immediate needs, but for future generations. Building things meant to last beyond your lifetime. The concept of legacy, of leaving something behind, emerged with settlement, but it also created new anxieties. What if your children couldn't hold what you'd built? What if outsiders took what you'd accumulated? The fear of loss, of dispossession, became a constant undercurrent in settled psychology. Defense became important in ways it hadn't been for nomads. Nomads could flee from threats. Settlers had investments they couldn't abandon: walls, weapons, vigilance. The militarization of society began with the need to protect accumulated wealth. The earlier settlements often show evidence of defensive structures: ditches, palisades, towers for watching. The threat of violence shaped settlement design from the beginning. The peaceful village is partly myth. Cooperation within the settlement, balanced against competition with other settlements. US versus them thinking, which existed in nomadic bands, intensified with settlement. Territories were claimed and defended, boundaries mattered in new ways. Religion adapted to settled life. Gods became tied to specific places. Sacred sites required permanent temples. Priesthoods developed to maintain these places and perform regular rituals. The spiritual landscape became fixed. The concept of sacred land emerged. Land that belonged to the gods. land whose use was restricted, land that provided income for temples and priests. Religious economics began with early settlements. Agricultural rituals tied the spiritual to the practical prayers for rain, offerings for good harvests, thanksgiving for abundance. The gods became interested in crops and weather in ways that hunter-gatherer spirits hadn't been. Calendars became more precise, knowing when to plant, when to harvest, when to perform rituals required tracking time carefully. The astronomical observations that eventually became science began with agricultural necessity. Writing might have originated in settlement needs. The earliest writing we have records, transactions, inventories, debts, who owes what to whom, how much grain is stored, administrative needs driving cognitive innovation. The concept of debt itself is a settled phenomenon. Nomads share and reciprocate, but the elaborate tracking of obligations that characterizes agricultural societies required staying put long enough to collect what was owed. Social complexity increased with settlement. More people interacting regularly, more roles to fill, more relationships to manage. The social brain that evolved for nomadic band life had to adapt to denser, more complex networks. Some researchers believe this complexity drove cognitive development. The challenges of settled life, managing property and relationships and obligations, selected for intelligence in ways nomadic life hadn't. Settlement might have made us smarter, or it might have created new forms of intelligence while diminishing others. Settled people might have lost some of the spatial navigation skills of nomads, the environmental knowledge of hunter-gatherers. Different ways of life develop different minds. Art changed with settlement. Portable art gave way to permanent installations, wall paintings that couldn't be moved, sculptures too heavy to carry, monumental architecture that declared the importance of place. Music might have changed too. Though we can't hear ancient music, fixed venues for performance, instruments too large to carry, traditions maintained in one place over generations. The concert hall is a very old idea. Cuisine developed regional identities, local ingredients, local preparation methods, local seasonings. The concept of traditional food, of grandmother's recipes, requires staying in one place long enough for traditions to form. Language might have diversified differently with settlement. Nomadic bands that encountered each other frequently maintained linguistic connections. Settled populations could diverge more completely. The babble of languages reflects thousands of years of settled isolation. Childhood changed. Nomadic children needed to be mobile to keep up with the band. Settled children could be slower to develop because mobility wasn't crucial. Extended childhood with more time for learning might be a settlement adaptation. Old age changed too. The elderly who couldn't keep up with nomadic movements might have been left behind or abandoned. Settled communities could support non-productive members. Grandparents became a permanent presence. The knowledge of elders became more valuable in settlements. They remembered how things were done. They knew the history of the place. They could teach skills accumulated over lifetimes. Wisdom traditions developed with settlement. Gender relations probably changed, though the direction is debated. Some argue that women's status declined with settlement because men controlled land and surplus. Others argue that women's control of household production gave them power. The evidence is mixed. What is clear is that gender roles became more rigid with settlement. The flexibility that nomadic life required gave way to more defined expectations. Men did certain things, women did other things. Deviation became more noticeable and often punished. Family structure solidified. The nuclear or extended family as a permanent unit, residing in a fixed dwelling, became the norm. The more fluid kinship arrangements of nomadic bands gave way to defined households. Marriage became more institutionalized. Property transfer between families at marriage. Contracts defining obligations. The economic aspects of marriage intensified because there was more to transfer and protect. Privacy emerged as a concept and a possibility. In nomadic bands, almost everything was visible to everyone. Settled dwellings created spaces that could be hidden. Secrets became possible. Inner lives could diverge from public faces. This privacy had consequences. Individual psychology could develop in ways nomadic visibility prevented: introspection, private thoughts, interior experiences unknown to the community. The inner self is partly a settled invention, but privacy also enabled deception, abuse, corruption. Things done behind closed doors that the community couldn't witness or prevent. The privacy that protects individual freedom also shields wrongdoing. If you are still awake, consider how much of your inner life depends on privacy. The thoughts you don't share, the experiences you keep to yourself, the gap between your public and private self. These are settler innovations. Nomadic peoples today, the few who remain, often seem more psychologically transparent. What you see is closer to what you get. The elaborate inner lives that settled peoples develop might be responses to the permanent surveillance of the village. The village saw everything. Your neighbors knew your business. Gossip tracked every deviation from norms. The panopticon was invented in the first settlements, long before Bentham designed his famous prison. Escaping this surveillance required either inner privacy or physical movement. Some people developed rich private lives. Others left for other villages. For cities when they arose, for anywhere they could be unknown. The tension between belonging and autonomy might have intensified with settlement. Nomads could drift away from conflicts. Settlers had to either stay and manage or make the dramatic choice to leave their investments behind. Many chose to stay, to accept the constraints of settled life in exchange for its benefits, to build identities bound to place, to become the village people we mostly still are, even when we live in cities. The first settlements created templates we still live by. The home as center, the property as extension of self, the community as source of identity and constraint, the year as agricultural cycle, even when we don't farm. Holidays reflect this. Thanksgiving at harvest time, celebrations at planting. The rhythm of the year that structures modern life, even for people who've never touched soil. We're still living in settler time. Rest now in your settled dwelling, in the patterns established 12,000 years ago, in the templates that shape your life whether you recognize them or not. You are living in the world the first villages made. Tomorrow you'll wake and go about your settled life, working, eating, socializing in patterns that echo the first permanent communities. The first settlers would recognize more than you might think. The basics haven't changed, but they couldn't have imagined the scale cities of millions. Nations spanning continents, global connections that link every settlement on Earth. What began in small villages exploded into something beyond any villager's imagination. You are part of that explosion, living in its midst, shaped by its forces, connected to the first settlers by an unbroken chain of settlement, village to town to city, to wherever you are tonight. The first human settlements, the experiments that made everything possible. The decision to stay that changed what it means to be human. Rest well in the world they created. Thanks for this journey to the time before cities, to the villages that came first, to the ancestors who chose to stay and build rather than wander and leave. Subscribe and stick around for more explorations of how we became what we are, more transitions that shaped existence, more evidence that the past lives in the present. Sleep well, sleep settled, sleep home. Good night. From the first villages, from the beginning of home, from 12,000 years of staying put. Before cities, after wandering, villages made the difference. Good night. One more thought before sleep takes you. The first settlements also established our relationship with the natural world in ways that persist. The boundary between inside and outside, the distinction between wild and cultivated, the concept of nature as something separate from human life. Nomads lived in nature. They were part of the landscape, moving through it, taking from it, leaving it largely unchanged. Settlers lived against nature. They cleared it, tamed it, pushed it back to create spaces for human purposes. The walls of the first settlements marked this boundary. Inside was human space. Outside was everything else. The division that seems so natural to us required creation. It required the decision that some land would be transformed. Domesticated plants and animals were the tools of this transformation. They were nature-made to serve human purposes, selected, bred, controlled. The wildness bred out of them generation by generation until they couldn't survive without human care. Modern crops can't compete with wild plants. Modern livestock can't survive without protection. They're creatures of the settlement, as dependent on human walls as humans are. The domestication was mutual, though humans directed it. The environmental consequences of settlement accumulated slowly at first, then faster. Forests cleared for fields, rivers diverted for irrigation, wildlife pushed to the margins, the human footprint expanding with each generation. The first settlers couldn't have predicted the scale of impact their way of life would eventually have. They were just feeding their families, just building their homes. The aggregate effect of millions of settlements over thousands of years was invisible to each individual village. We face similar blindness today. Individual actions seem harmless. Collective impact is devastating. The tragedy of the commons was born in the first villages, when common resources began to be overused because no one owned them but everyone used them. Some early settlements developed commons management systems that worked. Rules about grazing, harvesting, water use, governance that balanced individual needs with collective sustainability. The solutions existed when communities were wise enough to implement them. Others failed, degraded their environments until the village could no longer support itself, moved on to fresh land if it was available, collapsed if it wasn't. The sustainability challenge is as old as settlement itself. We're still running that experiment. Can settled humans live sustainably? Can we balance immediate needs with long-term viability? 12,000 years of evidence suggests it is possible but difficult. We've succeeded sometimes and failed often. The climate change challenge is just the latest version of this old problem. Can this generation of settlers, spread across an entire planet, manage their collective impact on the systems that sustain them? The first villages would recognize the dilemma. But enough of worry for one night. The first settlements gave us many gifts, along with many problems. The security of home, the accumulation of knowledge, the specialization that created art and science, the surplus that freed some minds for contemplation. You are contemplating tonight because your ancestors settled down, because surplus food freed them from constant foraging, because accumulated knowledge could be passed down, because the leisure that settlement created eventually became the time you are using now. This video exists because of settlement. The technology that created it, the knowledge that filled it, the time you have to watch it. All of these trace back to the first villages, to the decision to stay and build. The story of the first settlements is your story. The ancestors who first stayed in one place are your ancestors, directly or indirectly. The choices they made shaped the world you inherited. The patterns they established continue in your life. Rest now knowing this connection, knowing that the home around you has a history stretching back 12,000 years, knowing that the settled life you live is an experiment still in progress, still discovering its consequences. Tomorrow will be another day of settled life, another day of the experiment, another chance to do it better than the villages that failed, another opportunity to learn from the ones that succeeded. The first settlers would wish you well. They took enormous risks to create the pattern you are living. They faced uncertainty that we can barely imagine. They made it work well enough for the lineage to continue to you. Honor them by resting well, by appreciating the home they invented, by recognizing the settled life as an achievement, however imperfect, by continuing the experiment with whatever wisdom you can muster. Life before cities. The villages that made cities possible. The first permanent homes that led to yours. The beginning of everything that settlement means. Thanks for this time with the first settlements, with the ancestors who stopped moving, with the beginning of home and all its consequences. Subscribe and stick around. There is always more to explore about how we became what we are. More origins to uncover, more connections between past and present to discover. Sleep well in your settled place. Dream of ancestors building the first permanent walls. Dream of the moment humanity decided to stay. Dream of the beginning that made tonight possible. Good night from 12,000 years ago. From the first villages, from every ancestor who built a home and stayed in it. They would recognize your home tonight. Not the technology, but the concept. The idea that you belong somewhere and somewhere belongs to you. That idea is their gift. Receive it well. Rest well. Dream well. The first human settlements. Life before cities. The beginning of everything we call home. Good night.